Good morning and welcome to the October 21st, 2024 Finance Committee meeting for the Lee Summit R7 School District. We'll begin with item 1.01, contracts of $15,000 and less. It's a fairly long list this month. Variety of topics everywhere from academic to activities and athletics, fundraisers, a number of items that are on this list. Are there any questions? All right, not hearing any questions, we'll move on to item 1.02, contracts $15,000 and greater. To the contrast, this list this month is extremely short. We don't have a month like this often, so just one item on this list, and we'll cover that here in just a moment. Moving on to Section 2, Finance. Mr. Holder.
Good morning, everyone. We'll start with our transfer for the month of September. We did have a more normal transfer. If you remember, July, we did not have one. August was very small, which is very typical for us. And then our September transfer amount, it will fluctuate a little bit, but it's more in line with what you would normally expect to see on a month-to-month basis. Any questions on that? All right. Start with our revenue and expense report. Once again, through the month of September. So from our fiscal year standpoint, we've reached the quarter mark. We are 1/4 of the way through our fiscal year. All of our payrolls have started for all of our employee groups. Of course, 12-month employees starts in July. Our teachers start in August, and then we have a few positions that based on when their start date towards the end of August, and their payrolls start in the middle of September. So all of those have come on up to this point. So we'll start looking at our revenue, the top left-hand corner, and really on the revenue and expense side, as we look at both these areas, you'll see kind of a trend, but one's positive and one is one that we'll monitor. On the revenue side, we know that we're a little bit short in the operating fund, just from a percentage standpoint of where we were at last year. But at this point in the year, not really concerned with that. I would think that we'll see that gap will close as we move through the fall, definitely into the winter months. And then, of course, we'll see what happens with collections in December and January. But that's really where we'll get a good idea by the end of January into February of where we stand. So overall, just we're down a little bit from a percentage standpoint, but not concerned at this point in the year. The special revenue fund, just a reminder that, this is a fund that will likely lag throughout the entire school year until we get to June, really, because with the new formula that's in place for the 24-25 school year, we will be estimating our ADA, which will then allow us to capture some weighted ADA on the free and reduced lunch side, as well as the LEP side, along with a very robust summer school that we had. So this will lag as we go through the year. And so I don't want anyone to be alarmed when they look at the revenue and they're looking at a percentage for this year as compared to last year. It is expected. And so really we should see that lag, but it should turn around once we get to the month of June. As we go through the other areas, again, very early in the year, just note the bond fund is exactly where it was because we've spent all those funds. So you will not see any change there in revenue or expenses for that bond fund category. I thought about taking it out, but knowing that possibly in June, there could be some new revenue that comes in there. We may just leave it in there. And so just know that that fund will stay static as we move through the next 7-8 months. Moving over to nutrition services, again, from a revenue side, running a little bit ahead of where we were the year prior, as well as the activity and before and after school. So very early, but at least among those three restricted funds, we're running just a little bit ahead from a revenue standpoint of where we were the year before. So going down to the expense side, I want to highlight the operating fund. It is very early, but I think this is an area that is at least worth pointing out at this point in the year. From an expense side, we're down over 1% from the year before. Now, again, there can be some variables in the first 3 months of the fiscal year that can, skew that data a little bit. But I think from a trend standpoint, we saw this really the last 2 months as well. So we'll continue to monitor that. But generally, when your expenses are running a little bit cooler than they were the year before, from a percentage standpoint, that's a good thing. Now, on the special revenue fund, we're just a little bit above 0.12%. So I'm not really concerned about that trend. I did go back. I actually looked at the last 3 years. And every time in the month of September, that special revenue fund expense has been in the 18th percentile. As you can see, last year it was 18.16%. Actually, the year before that, it was exactly 18.28, what it is today. And then even a year previous to that, it was 18.73. So we're definitely in the range of where we typically see those Fund 2 expenses on a year-to-year basis. Again, moving across the other three, very early with debt service, we've just had an interest payment. The main payments won't come out until February. Now, capital projects are, we discussed last month, we've done a lot of work with capital projects. A lot of that occurs over the summer. That includes a large payment that we had for buses, over 3.2 million that hit in this fiscal year. So that capital projects fund, especially as it compares to the year prior, we've spent a lot of those budgeted expenses. That number will continue to go even a little bit higher in October, and then we should see that level out a little bit and remain closer to that 21.5 million mark that we've budgeted for. Of course, there may be some expenses that come up, and as they do, then, as we look to a budget amendment later this fall or maybe in January, we can always adjust capital projects if we need to at that time. So looking at nutrition services from the expense standpoint, again, just under 18%, running a little bit higher than we were the year previous. But if you compare that to revenue, our revenue is a little bit ahead of schedule as well. So I think that makes sense. Those two typically are tied together, as are our activity funds. Expenses, our revenue's up a little bit, but our expenses are up a little bit. And again, this is just through September, so still very early in our fiscal year. And then before and after school services, you'll notice 31.42. Again, we are down to less than 10 employees that are LSR7 employees in that before and after school services program. That's why that overall budget is really low. As if you go back 2 or 3 years, you would see that budget be a lot more in the area of before and after school care. So we'll continue to monitor that, but I think we may have to raise it a little bit, but that'll be pretty close to what our overall budget is, around that 500,000 mark. And we continue to make good progress there, as we'll see down below. So if you want to go down to the bottom right corner, again, our restricted funds, as it compares to last year, we know nutrition services is a little bit lower. We're at that $1.5 million mark. We'll continue to monitor that. It is likely that we'll drop a little bit more as we go through the year, but we should still have a positive fund balance in nutrition. again, activity and foundation will fluctuate. Those are restricted funds. Those accounts roll over from year to year. So there's always a little bit of variance there. Balance is a little bit higher at this point in the year, but that could obviously remain the same or change by the time we get to June. And then before and after school services, just want to again highlight the progress we've made there. If you look a year ago, we were at negative 474,000. That's now down under 100,000. We just had a meeting with the Y last week, continue to make positive gains there. And so again, every month we'll chip away at that a little bit. And at some time, I think early in 2025, we should see that number actually move back into the positive territory. So that's been a few years coming, but it's nice to see that progress finally come to fruition. Looking at our current fund balance, again, just under $50 million in our operating funds. We know that we're getting to the point of the year, especially in October and November, where we reach our lowest fund balances. When we get to October, you'll see that number go down even more. Get to November, you'll see it at its lowest point, with operating balances that would probably be around the 10% mark. That will recover quickly in December, and then of course January and February we reach our peak, and then we just follow the same trend from February down to November of 2025. But overall, really where we would expect our fund balances to be at this point in the year. Any questions on the revenue and expense report? All right, next we have our investment report. Really not a lot has changed from last month. I just want to highlight again, really as we look out through this fiscal year, we see one CD that's a $245,000 CD that's at 5.2%. We will not be able to achieve that with the current market conditions. But if you look at all the other maturities that are expiring, we will be able to exceed that rate of return. So, the last 18 months, we've really, the revenue generated from these investments has doubled. And that trend should continue as we move through this fiscal year. Really, you have to get out into 2026 even to see rates of return that, as we look to replace those, then maybe a little bit lower than what we have now. So overall, again, with it being October, our investment funds are at the lowest level that they will be. They'll be a little bit lower possibly in October, and then in November, but then they'll shoot back up in terms of what we have in those MOSIP and MOCAP funds. Then, of course, as you recall, the bond was on here for quite a while, but that fund is at zero, and so we won't show that unless there's another bond fund that, as I said, may get generated in June, and then we would reflect that when it comes on.
Mr. Holder.
Yes, sir.
You mentioned in December and January and February were our highest levels of reserves. How do we take advantage of those high levels as far as in investing those funds and taking advantage of that opportunity?
Yeah, great question. So typically what we'll do in a normal environment is when we have the high cash balances, we'll look at term investments. That can be anywhere from a month to 3 months, even out to 6 months. And so those term investments allow us in a normal market to get a little bit higher rate of return. As you all know, that we've been in a little bit of a weird place where actual liquid interest rates for money that you can get your hands on the next day has been at an all-time high. And as you go out a little further, it's actually a lower rate of return. That is turning around a little bit. So Yeah, typically what we'll do is we will invest them because we know that we won't need them for a month or 3 months or 6 months. And so we ladder that with varying amounts. And so, we make sure what expires at the end of the 3 month term we can use for our expenses. And then, of course, going out 6 months. And six is about typically as far as we would go with any of those short-term investments, because we know that once we get to this time of year, our cash flows are going to be at their lowest mark. All right, moving on to our balance sheet. One other thing I will mention on the investment report, it's okay, we don't need to go back to it, but I noticed there at the bottom, our liquid funds in MOSIP and MOCAT, you notice that at the end of September, they were over 5%. But we're down now to about 4.8. Of course, with the Fed move in September, lowering the interest rate 50 basis points or 0.5%. The market had already priced that in a little bit, but we did see those rates go from about 5.06 down to 4.81, 4.83 here recently. So I think we've realized at least we've hit where we're going to be. Of course, we'll see, what the Fed ends up doing over the next few months, but still very good historically to have liquid funds at just under 5% rate of return. So looking at the balance sheet, really, if you will focus down on the bottom column, our total liabilities and fund balances, again, you see that 49.9 million for our general operating in terms of what is really our cash reserve. You see our debt service at 10. Capital projects, you'll notice that negative 5.2, and I highlighted that last month. I don't want you to be alarmed by that. But that will remain that way really until we get to probably February. And then it may possibly be negative again at some point in the spring until we make our fund balance transfer. If you remember, we were budgeted to have our Fund 4 balance be down just below $5 million at the end of this fiscal year, and that's down from 14. So, and there's also, some possible projects on the horizon where we may need that may be capital expenses as well. So again, don't want to alarm anyone. I just want to make sure everyone is aware of that. So you may be wondering, well, what's the practical impact of that? Because on paper, you're showing negative 5.2. So the practical impact of that is when you look at all these fund balances, if you remember, in the bank, most of these funds are held in one bank account, right? And so we split them out on paper because that's what's required by the state of Missouri. So really that 5.2 million, just like Bass always has, is just a reduction on all the other bottom line numbers here at the bottom of the balance sheet. So we'll continue to watch that. Again, not unplanned. We knew that we would be experiencing that because we are, trying to be purposefully aggressive with a lot of our capital project work that is needed to be done. And so we'll just continue to monitor that as we go through the fiscal year, but that will turn around a little bit as we start getting local tax revenue in, but then really that merchants and manufacturing, when we receive that, which is typically in February, is where we'll put a big dent into that number. Any questions on the balance sheet? All right, thank you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Holder. Moving on to Section 3, Facilities. Mr. Gurrell.
All right, good morning. I have one contract this morning to present, and that is for Integrated Pest Management, or we call it IPM. Board policy EBAC does require that we go through an integrated pest management process and have a vendor to lead us through. What that means is that we will handle pests in our district in ways that doesn't always mean pesticides. We're always looking for other means to prevent pests and not just have chemicals be our first course of action. We submitted an RFP and had 4 vendors respond. We evaluated each of those, an evaluation team based on their qualifications, the personnel, and experience with the district. And overall, Shendel Pest Services was the selected vendor. They scored the highest in all categories, and the district does have experience with them. They've been our service provider for many years, and that's probably led to their lower costs, just kind of knowing what they're dealing with. And they've provided good work for us over the past, and we are glad to recommend them for approval again. So I'll be glad to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Grell. Moving on to section 4, future agenda items. We're going to spend just a moment on this document. I want our board members to just take a moment and see the future projects and goods and services that we plan to bring before the finance committee and before the board. So just as a reminder, on the left-hand column here, we have anticipated date, and the service or the good or the item that we plan to bring, and then the project manager. And I want to highlight that column as well. The reason we provide this information in this document to the committee and to the board is so, one, they know projects that are coming, but 2, if there are questions that someone would like to raise, a board member would like to raise, they know who to go to for that. So just thinking about the month of November, so just here shortly, it'll be here before we know it. We have the IEP platform, the assessment platform, the purchase of new 2026 model buses, printing of the school newsletter, integrated pest services. We actually took care of that this month which was that last agenda item, assessment development, delivery tools, and proficiency tracking tools. And so you can see what we plan to bring to you in November, and you can see the budget managers who you would go to if you had questions or comments about those items. And you can kind of go down the list and see all the other items that are coming. But I just want to take a moment, since our agenda was a little shorter this month, and just take a moment to highlight this document a little bit more than we normally do. Are there any questions or comments about the information that's provided on this document?
I don't have any questions, but I just appreciate that you put this together for us to be able to kind of see a forecast. So thank you.
You're very welcome. And that's exactly what it is. It's a forecast. It's be able to look around the corner to see what's coming, and that's exactly the purpose of this document, so that we can be thoughtful and purposeful in the work we're doing, and responding to the questions that the board members may have.
Thank you.
Well, all right. Well, that concludes our agenda for today and the Finance Committee meeting. So we will adjourn at this time. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Dr. Shelton.